Today, I have 8 amazing family coasters that almost no one ever talks about. Let's start off with Verbolten. Verbolten is a launched family coaster that's themed around a leisurely stroll down the German Autobahn gone wrong. At the beginning of the ride, you're just casually journeying through Germany until all of a sudden when you're launching into the Black Forest. But before we get too far, I think we need to answer an important question. What is a family coaster? Well, a family coaster is a type of coaster that's more intense than a kiddie coaster, but less intense than a major coaster. These coasters appeal to basically everyone, which is why it's essential for parks to have a good family coaster. And Verbolten and all the other family coasters I'm going to talk about in this video are perfect examples of good family coasters. Anyways, once you get launched into the Black Forest, it's unsurprisingly pretty dark, with your only sources of light coming from these theming elements that get lit up as you pass them. There are a few of these, but for the most part you're in complete darkness, which makes this section feel way faster and more intense than it actually is. That's not to say it's not intense, as there's a helix that is surprisingly forceful for a family coaster. That's followed by a few slower turns and stops until you slowly roll through more of those neat light up things, and then you come to a stop, and then boom, drop track. These are really fun elements that basically wombo combo roller coasters with drop towers. There aren't many coasters out there that have them, so it's always a treat to ride a coaster with one. Anyways, after the drop track, you take a tiny drop down and hit the second launch of the ride, which takes you into these quick back-to-back turns which lead into this shed, which gives a beautiful view of Busch Gardens Williamsburg. You don't get to appreciate that view for too long though, because the train dives down towards the river and takes a few more quick back-to-back turns. These turns actually pay homage to the Big Bad Wolf, the roller coaster that once stood where Verbolten stands today, with Verbolten's finale being nearly identical to the finale on Big Bad Wolf. This serves as an excellent way to continue Big Bad Wolf's legacy, and it's overall a great ending to a great ride. Now, that being said, Verbolten isn't perfect, and it has some sizable flaws, most notably how rough it is. It's kinda bumpy throughout the entire ride, with some uniquely rough moments like this turn and that little drop after the drop track, where if you're in the back row, your head gets smashed into the back seat because of that launch. But really, these aren't that big of a deal, and Verbolten is a perfect stepping stone between something like Invader and the park's bigger coasters like Pantheon or Alpengeist. Speaking of Invader, another family wooden coaster is Zembezi Zinger at Worlds of Fun. This is a unique family coaster manufactured by GCI that I don't really see anyone talking about, which is a shame because this is a great coaster with a bunch of elements that are just a little bit out of the ordinary for a wooden coaster, specifically that spiral lift hill. This gives the coaster a really unique look, and it's a pretty fun way to start the ride off. After the spiral lift, you go down the first drop, which is about 50-50 steel and wooden track. The switch between the two is very noticeable as it switches from glass smooth to traditional wooden coaster bumpy pretty suddenly. This isn't a bad thing, and I actually enjoy the bumpiness of a good wooden coaster, but this sudden transition is a little jarring and honestly kind of uncomfortable. The drop is then followed by a few standard GCI elements, and then you take this turn around the lift hill, and because it uses that steel track, this turn is wildly smooth, like one of the smoothest elements I have ever experienced. Now, this turn is followed by a drop where the track transitions back from steel to wood, which is yet again pretty jarring. And then it goes through a standard airtime hill that doesn't really give airtime, and then that transitions into a section of these fast, super low to the ground turns that are super out of the ordinary for GCI. If you're unfamiliar, GCI is one of the most prolific wooden coaster manufacturers in the industry, making world-class coasters like Mystic Timbers at Kings Island and Predator, which is also at Worlds of Fun. Generally, GCI coasters are pretty formulaic, featuring a mixture of those little airtime hills with these large turns that also feature a little pop of airtime. Zembezi Zinger completely disregards this formula and ends with a bunch of these rapid-fire close to the ground turns. The reason they went against the formula is probably because, just like Verbolten, Zembezi Zinger pays homage to a previous coaster, with elements of the layout like the spiral lift hill and low to the ground turns being references to the previous Zembezi Zinger that was at the park from 1973 to 1999. These references to the previous Zembezi Zinger are fun and add an element of weird and wackiness that I love to see in coasters, all while keeping the coaster relatively tame, making it perfect for families. That being said, as a coaster, Zembezi Zinger isn't perfect, and while I haven't had any issues with it, a lot of people have said that the trains on the Zinger are really uncomfortable. And when compared to the couch disguised as coaster trains that's typically used on GCI coasters, the new trains aren't amazing. They also aren't bad. I honestly quite enjoyed them, although they might be the reason the coaster makes this really annoying high-pitched squeal. This is noticeable throughout the entire coaster, but it's at its worst when going through the turn around the spiral lift hill. It's honestly headache-inducing. Speaking of spiral lifts, another family coaster that starts with a spiral is Backlot Stunt Coaster. I'm really grasping at straws for these transitions. Holy. Anyways, the Backlot Stunt Coaster is a family launch coaster operating in Virginia, Canada,
and Ohio.
And Ohio.
Can't forget about Ohio.
Can't forget about Ohio. Anyways, it's a family launch coaster operating at Kings Island, Kings Dominion, and Canada's Wonderland. These coasters were originally themed to the 2003 film The Italian Job, being named Italian Job Stunt Track, with the ride experience taking you through the climactic chase scene at the end of the movie. Now, after the parks were bought by Cedar Fair, the coasters did lose their Italian Job branding, being renamed to Backlot Stunt Coaster, but the majority of the theming throughout the ride was untouched. And this is some decent theming. It even has a show scene in the middle with an impressive amount of fire. And in my opinion, this theming is what really makes the ride stand out. Apart from one moment, which we'll talk about in a little, the coaster is a rather standard family coaster, featuring a bunch of turns and airtimeless airtime hills. But because these elements go through theming, it makes it really interesting, and the ending with that show scene is really cool and an absolute highlight of the ride. But really, anything that includes fire is a highlight for me. I love fire. These coasters also have one other standout moment. The helix you hit immediately after the first launch. This is brutally intense and actually caused me to slightly gray out once. If you're unfamiliar, a gray out is where you start to lose vision, with your vision turning gray from the outside in. This is typically caused by high levels of positive G-forces. Graying out is wild for a coaster that's otherwise a decently tame family coaster, and honestly, it makes me hesitate to call it a family coaster because just how intense this helix is. That being said, it isn't a very sustained moment of forces, and the time I did gray out, it only lasted for like a second, and it wasn't a super intense gray out, as I just barely lost vision. That all being said, Backlot Stunt Coaster is definitely a family coaster. It's just a little bit more wild than the rest. That statement definitely holds true for Cheetah Hunt 2, which is the next coaster we're going to talk about. Cheetah Hunt is yet another launched family coaster, this one being manufactured by Intamin. The majority of Cheetah Hunt's layout is pretty chill and family coastery, with slow scenic turns and solid airtime moments that ease until you hit the Heartline roll about halfway through the coaster. This really begs the question of if family coasters can have inversions. This could probably be its own video, but in my opinion, family coasters can have inversions as long as they fit with the rest of the ride and aren't too intense. And I think this inversion is a great example of that, as it fits into the first half of Cheetah Hunt perfectly, being graceful and floaty just like all the other elements in the first half, which honestly is an underrated section of the ride. Quite frankly, the entirety of Cheetah Hunt is underrated. Like, it understandably gets overshadowed by the bigger coasters in the park like Iron Gwazi, but it was a highlight of my trip to Busch Gardens Tampa. It's an overall great coaster that anyone in the family can enjoy. Speaking of Busch Gardens Tampa, let's stay at the park and talk about Cobra's Curse. This is a very well-themed family spinning coaster manufactured by Mach Rides. This is kind of like a small boy version of their Extreme Spinner model, and it's a perfect fit for a themed family coaster like this because it allows the train to interact with the story. You start out forwards, and then you flip backwards, and then you freely spin. This makes the ride feel super unique and makes it super re-rideable because of that spinning section at the end. Now, I got a couple more family coasters to talk about, but I don't want this video to feel repetitive or redundant, so let's finish off with a quick speed round, starting out with Wavebreaker, the rescue coaster at SeaWorld San Antonio. This is a jet ski style family coaster that takes place over water and has some of the best visuals of any coaster I've ever ridden. The ride experience consists of 2 surprisingly punchy launches and some smooth and graceful turns over the water. It also has some shockingly smooth brakes. Like, these are possibly the smoothest brakes I've ever experienced. Anyways, moving on. Let's talk about the Wild Mouse at Cedar Point. This is a brand new coaster, and it adds a much needed family coaster to the park. That being said, in comparison to everything else we've looked at in this video, it's a little bit weaker of a family coaster, with your overall enjoyment of the coaster basically being dependent on how much spinning you do. If you don't spin at all, like on my first ride, it's honestly a boring experience. But if you spin a ton, like on my second ride, it's pretty fun and out of control. And overall, the coaster is a good stepping stone between smaller coasters like the Mine Train and the bigger coasters like Maverick and Steel Vengeance. And speaking of bigger coasters, the last one I want to talk about today is Hagrid's Magical Creatures Motorbike Adventure. I know this isn't really a forgotten family coaster that no one talks about, but I wanted to briefly mention it in this video because this is basically the family coaster perfected. It's got amazing theming and an overall great ride experience, all without being too intense for basically everyone. And while it is definitely one of the most talked about family coasters out there, I do think it's a little bit overshadowed at the park by Velocicoaster, which is one of the best roller coasters I've ever ridden. But is it a perfect coaster? My video on Velocicoaster is right there.